Hey, so in this video, I just want to go through the basics of the template file that you all were given. In this one, I'm going to go through the basic version just so you see kind of how it works and the steps that are here. So as a reminder, my data set is inside the folder called data, and I'm using this one called data, and it has a couple of headers, date, miles, mood, and smell. And you can see running down here the different numbers for each column. It's a little bit offset just because it shrinks down, but each line is separated by a comma. So walking through, at the very top of the sketch is where you import the library for exporting as a PDF. Now you could save as a JPEG and import it into Photoshop, or you could export as a PDF. To put in an external library into a sketch, you go to Tools, you go to Sketch, Import Library, and then you would click on PDF Export, and it puts it at the very top. We already have that in there. The next line is our way of storing our CSV file in a variable. So we're going to be bringing in our CSV file as a variable so we can access it later on in the sketch. And we're putting it at the very top of our sketch so that way it can be accessed anywhere. This is called a global variable. Now, everything that happens after that point is inside the setup function. So from this point, and notice when I put my cursor here, it shows me the one that's being closed, highlighted with this little box around it. And our first step is creating our document size. And I'm setting it to 400 by 400 pixels. The next function is called begin record. And this is connected to the import library for processing to export a PDF. And we say the file type here, followed by a comma. And then we give it a name. And notice this is inside quotes. If I remove the outside quote, it's going to give me an argument saying, hey, your string literal is not properly closed by a double quote. So now it's closed off. And this title could change depending on what you want to call it. But I think this works right now. And it exports directly to your folder. Then we set a background color. And you could change this as well. Currently, this is a color that is pretty dark. It's close to black. Number 255 would be white. Now, this next step is our table that we initialized at the very top, of the sketch, is going to store our CSV file. Now, inside here, we're using a function called load table, and inside that it takes two properties. The first one is the name of our CSV file. And this needs to be named the exact same way as what our file is. So for example, if this was data with a capital D, and I try and run this, I'm getting an error because it says the file is named data.csv with a capital D, not lowercase d. So you need to be really consistent about how you're naming your elements. And now if I try and run this again, we should not get an error. This next line, header, is a second argument inside the load table function that says use these elements at the very top as a way to grab the information inside each column. So this is our way that we actually access the data. It's our easier way. There's other ways to do it. This is the easiest way. This next line stores the amount of rows in our CSV file as variable. And this is we're going to use this right down in our for loop. But this, if we added numbers to our CSV file, if we took away numbers, this number will dynamically change and it'll make our sketch run as smoothly as possible. And then this is some debugging that prints to our terminal down at the bottom. So row count equals table.row count. So I'm storing this number inside a variable, and then I'm printing to the terminal row count And then this is called concatenation, when you attach a variable or string to a string. And if you scroll up to the top, we'll see this has 17 total rows in the table. This should actually have a little space here. So now if I rerun this, then we'll see, come back up. Then this will actually have a space between them. Looks a little nicer. This for loop allows us to cycle through each row of data inside our CSV file. It's going to use the variable I as a way to cycle through each row inside our table. And it's going to run for as many rows as we have. So since we have 17 rows, it's going to run 17 times. This next line is going to say for each, it allows us to get each row inside the table. And using this index I, which first time it runs, it's 0, means that it's going to grab this row first. So this is row 0. This one is row 1, row 2, row 3. So each time this code runs, we're just making it a little bit easier by saying table.getRow, table.getRow I is stored in this variable called row. Because we could use this later on, but it's a lot cleaner to do this and a lot more efficient. So each time this runs, this number is going to change to increment to the next row. This next line, float miles equals get row miles, get float miles. So what this does is it gets the column that you would like to address. So here I'm looking, I want to grab this column called miles. So I'm going to put that same word inside here. And then I want to include the data type that that row includes. So if I look here, it's a little hard to see, but I know this 5.35 is attached to miles, which means it's a decimal, which means I want to use a float. If I was using whole numbers, I would use an integer. So for example, int miles equals row.getInt miles. Or as you'll see later on, if I want to do a string, I do the data type for string. So string smell, because all of those are words, smell equals row.getString. Notice this camel case. Smell. And I'm staying consistent in terms of the way that these are spelled up top here with a capital S, and same thing here. And so this is saying, since this dynamically changes each time this runs because of this note here, we're going to see it go through. And so each time the for loop, it'll increment and change. Now, oh, and lastly, I want to store this inside a variable that I can use. And I want to call it something similar to my column. So, I could call this potato, but honestly, that wouldn't really tell me anything. So I would want to stick this back to being called miles. Here's some debugging just to see, is it actually doing what I think I'm doing? And so in this first row, row number 1, it's telling me I ran 2 miles here. So I can go back to here and see, okay, row 1, miles 2. Cool, I know it's doing the right thing. And then we're getting into, now we're drawing it. So for each one, I'm giving a specific fill color. And this is a grayish color, 0 being black, 255 being white. And then I'm creating a variable called mover. And this is something that I'm inventing in here as a way to move my object down a little bit each time. Because the value of I is going to change each time the for loop runs. First time is 0, second time is 1, third time is 2, because it starts at 0, so third time is 2. So each time it's going to change this number in increments of 20. And I'm using that in the Y position of my rectangle. So it's going to move my whole shape down just a little bit each time by 20 pixels each time. And I chose 20 pixels because the height of my rectangle is 10 pixels. And so if I went less than 10, or if I went just at 10, we wouldn't really see that change. The last step here is I'm actually drawing a rectangle, and you could choose any shape that you want, but I'm just doing a simple bar graph. So I've got my rectangle. I'm positioning it consistently at the X position for 10, and then I'm moving it down by 20 pixels each time, and I'm using miles as my way of changing the width of each rectangle. And each rectangle is going to be 10 pixels in height. And when I play this, I get a kind of terrible bar graph. Like, it is really hard to see the difference in anything here. And the other examples that I have inside the template, the template folder, will show you how to change these. But just very quickly, one way that we can quickly change this is miles. Remember, if we look back here, a lot of these numbers, 2, 3, 3, 3, 4, 3, 2, 7, 5.35, 3, all those numbers are pretty similar. So to show a bigger difference, I could multiply miles by something like 20. And then if I rerun this, we're going to see a much clearer version of the difference between each of these. There's many ways to do this. This is one way. And just to show you an example of what happens when I change the mover, remember I said if I changed it to 10, to increase by 10 each time, they'll shrink down next to each other. So if I run this again, notice they're all tight. If I want more space between them, I think these will actually go off the page. Yep. So you can play around with these numbers as a way to see how large they're going to increment. But I thought 20 looked pretty good. And remember, they're all filling with the same color right here. All right, so this is the introduction to the basic version of this. I've put in comments. Oh, lastly, end record stops the recording of our PDF. And so our PDF will stop right before we, right at this one point, right before the end of our sketch. And so here it's going to stop right at the end of our sketch. And we want it to go there so it stops recording just before it ends. And it'll change our image each time this runs. So it keeps writing over our previous image. So right now they're white. I change this to 0. I think I'll actually get an error because it's open. But let's see. Yep, so my document is open right now, which is throwing it off a bit. So I have to close that up. Oh, wait, let's do stop. Let's rerun it again. Now they're all super dark inside there. Let's give it a different color. Fill. Run this again. And now when I go back and open this up, we'll see that they've changed to gray. So it'll constantly rewrite it. So if you want to have a new version, you need to copy and paste this to another file just so you have it. And that's the basics of this sketch. There is a version inside our all files that's the same basic sketch with no comments. That is a little bit easier to read in case you're like, I want to look at this without any comments. And in the next videos, I'm going to go over the integer and the string to see how other ways of manipulating this file.